Hello, and welcome to the Science Fiction and Fantasy Marketing Podcast, the show where we help you establish your author brand, increase the size of your audience, and sell more books. I'm Lindsay Baroker, and I'm here with Jeffrey Poole and Joe Lalo. Got another good guest for you this week. His name is Glynn Stewart. Glynn Stewart. Glynn, how do you say your name? It's got a Y, so I've not seen that before. It's kind of cool.
It's Welsh.
It's like when you want to make a fantasy character name, so you just change some of the vowels and you get this cool fantasy name.
You just steal from the Welsh.
All right. Let me just read you a really brief intro there on Amazon. He is a Canadian author, accountant, and housekeeper to cats, a fan of science fiction and fantasy books and RPGs of all stripes, both tabletop and computer. He's sold over 75,000 copies of his books between his Starship's Mage series and Castle Federation series. And it looked like you had some standalones out there too, is that right?
Yeah, a couple of fantasies.
Okay, we'll ask you about those a little later, but your intro is kind of brief on Amazon, so why don't you tell us a little bit about you and your writing?
The funny part is, that's longer than I thought it was. My VP marketing / wife has apparently added to that while I wasn't looking. As it says, sorry, I can't hear myself talk with both of those in. I am started as an accountant in Canada. I've been writing since I was a small child. I've lost track of so many pieces over the years. But I'm a heavy reader of science fiction and fantasy, so I started writing the same thing. And I actually eventually ended up with an agent and was doing traditional publishing and was getting roughly nowhere, which I'm sure is a story we're all very familiar with. My wife then suggested, she might have been my girlfriend at the time, this was a long time ago now, that I was looking at expanding a short story I'd written into a novel, and I was saying that it would only really turn into a novella. So what she suggested was writing a series of novellas that would make up a novel, and she would put together the covers for all of them for me. That turned into the Starship's Mage, what is now the Starship's Mage Omnibus. You can't get the actual episodes anymore, which were released once every 3 months through 2014 and did very, very well, and were followed up with Space Carrier Avalon, which started the Castle Federation series. And with both of those series going, it was kind of oh, hey, I'm actually making enough money to make a living at this for both of us. Can we run off and do that now? And that's what we did, and that's where we are.
Nice. So it sounds like your wife is kind of the mastermind behind everything.
Always. She's the smarter one. And the prettier one.
Okay, that's cool that you explained that, because I was kind of wondering, I looked at your book one and saw it was an omnibus, but it was also only like 200 pages or something, so I was like, you must have serialized something along the way.
Yeah, it was 125,000 words once all 5 of them were combined.
Nice. And you said you were kind of looking at traditional publishing. Have you since just said no thanks and said goodbye?
I still have an agent. My agent is still trying to sell my urban fantasy novels.
Okay, and when you're in Canada, do you still go to the same big 5 U.S. publishers, or do you guys try to do your own thing?
There are some Canadian publishers of various sizes, but mostly it's been through the big 5. My agent is in the U.S., so he submits to the ones he knows.
Cool. And have you had any trouble since, I guess I should ask you about the Starship Mage. It sounds like a blend of fantasy. I actually read the sample. I'm not really that prepared. I try to at least read a few pages of people's stuff the night before. But so he was a mage, right? And he's on spaceship. So have you had any challenges with
I expected to. And I've heard that some people have. I think that mixing space opera with fantasy is something that people find a bit more acceptable. It kind of falls into the same mold as the Star Wars mold. And Starship's Mage is, at its core, a space opera. It's a space opera with large chunks of fantasy and rules-based magic wrapped around it. But it's still a space opera, so people who buy it as a space opera aren't really surprised at what they're getting. I like to use the analogy of tandoori pizza. No one wants to get tandoori chicken pizza by accident. It's quite a shock to bite into a pizza and get spice and chicken and tandoori. But some people like tandoori chicken and some people like pizza. So if you're very clear that you're getting tandoori chicken pizza, people are very happy to get that. I'm very clear that people are getting a space fantasy novel, and people are generally happy when they get that. they're not being surprised. They're not feeling like they've been bait and switched into buying something they're not expecting.
Okay, and you actually, obviously, you're finding that more people than I would have guessed are into tandoori chicken pizza. Because I've seen some other series with like dragons in space and kind of a
Mm-hmm.
steampunk space thing before, but I don't think I've really seen any that sell super well. Did you have
There
any
are,
challenges?
I think I have in all of the reviews across 5 novellas and 3 novels, one of which was the combination of 5 novellas, 2 reviews complaining about me contaminating spaceships with magic. One is a 4-star review where they went, I really didn't expect this to work, and it really worked. And one is a 2-star review complaining quite literally about me contaminating spaceships in science fiction with magic. I don't.
You you think the titles would kind of be a clue to people?
Yeah, like I said, I'm very upfront about what I'm getting, and they sell well enough for me to feel that space fantasy is a genre that is actually somewhat underserved because people find it harder to find. And so, while the stuff is there, no one's quite sure how to find it, and there's a demand for it, but really all anyone can ever actually find is Star Wars.
Yeah,
There's a there's a Margaret Weis series from around when I was born, I think, God, the 80s. And then there was the Mage Worlds trilogy, which I've never actually managed to find a copy of, despite having been looking since I started writing Starship's Mage.
yeah, I can sympathize with that. My second book was kind of, I called it a science fantasy. At that point, I was gonna shop it around to agents and stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
that at least sounded like a term. Like I found it a few places, science fantasy. I think I
Mm-hmm.
eventually just called it steampunk, but it's not really. But it's
Mm-hmm.
that's the category I stuck it in Amazon. That's the closest thing that works.
I'm warned steampunk on Amazon is the kiss of death, so.
Yeah, I do best in it when if you can brand, like I'll put it in steampunk so I can appear at the top, and because a lot of my
Mm-hmm.
stuff kind of has those elements. But I also put it in sword and sorcery or epic fantasy, and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of it can cross over, so it can work.
Seems to work for you.
It's done okay. All right, but let me pass you to the guys to ask a few questions,
Okay.
and later I want to ask you what you're doing for marketing.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. All right. So my first question has got to do with sci-fi. There are varying degrees of scientific accuracy in sci-fi.
Mm-hmm.
How hard is the sci-fi that you write?
I tend to go on the one or two big lies. Starship's Mage, the big lie is pretty obvious right from the beginning. Outside the magic in that setting, it is, as much as I am capable of with a reasonable amount of research, the science in Starship's Mage is as accurate and as hard as I can make it. They can get away with a lot more because they've got magicians backing them up, but the actual science and the physics are as close to reality as I can make them. In the Castle Federation series, it's a bit softer. There's a few interesting interpretations of current theories and ideas in there, but a lot of what I have in there in terms is it's things like Alcubierre drives and 0 point energy and quantum entanglement. These are all things that we believe are possible, but we have no real concept of how they will work, if they're actually possible or not, or what they would look like. So I take my own spin on how each of those works to put together the technological paradigm of the setting.
Cool. It's interesting because generally speaking, what makes say interplanetary science fiction work is that there is something that allows faster than light travel to occur,
Mm-hmm.
and that thing, of course, does not exist, or at least is not known to us right now.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the fiction in science fiction, and for you, you filled that gap with magic, which the sufficiently advanced technology may as well have been.
Yeah,
So it sort of works in an
that
interesting
was
way.
actually the conceit behind Starship's Mage in the first place. Is we don't know how this is going to work anyway, so a wizard did it.
Excellent. All right. So traditionally, when magic and sci-fi elements occupy the same world, within the fiction there's a rivalry, if not an outright war between them. It sounds like science and magic get along pretty well in your setting.
Yes and no. So they do get along very well. The ships are very much, like I said, they're hard science fiction ships that happen to have magic runes woven throughout them. But in their culture, they have an ongoing conflict, low level at times, it threatens to explode on them at various points, between the mages and the mundanes. Part of that's grown out of the backstory of the mages were actually artificially created to be a ruling class, and effectively that's what they have become. So a lot of people are like, well, you were created to rule us, and now you're ruling us, and we don't like this. But there is also the conflict between those who regard themselves as both rationalists and religious, who have an issue with the concept of magic being the solution for so many of their culture's problems.
All right, so it's sort of a class conflict in your setting.
Yes, very
Cool.
much so.
That's excellent. And also you mentioned some ideology in there, which tends to be it's the flavor a lot of other people go with when this happens.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Another typical difference between magic and science is that readers will frequently dismiss an impossible bit of magic as, well, it's magic. We're not supposed to understand it. Science tends to require at least a hand way of explaining it. How do those play out? I should say, well, it's more or less been explained, but how do those play out? How well do people? You mentioned rules-based magic, so clearly you've got some consistency, and there's a way that it works. How do people react to magic, and how is magic more or less accepted?
In the setting or among the readers?
Well, in the setting.
Yeah. In the setting they've had magic at that point for about 200, 250 years. The limitations of magic in the setting are known. Everyone kind of knows what mages can't and can't do. They're wrong, but in the main. But everybody knows what you can and can't do. One of the major tricks of the first series is that the main character breaks several of those rules without even realizing he's broken them. So that drives a lot of the conflict in the original omnibus. But the rules are there. I understand what they are, but a lot of even the people studying in the setting don't understand what they are. So I don't actually ever explain to the reader what they are. I know how their magic works, but nobody else needs to.
That's roughly how it ought to be, really.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about rules, let's just on the subject of rules-based magic. When we talk about that, are we saying rules can have two meanings? Now, presumably, rules means this is how magic works. These are like Newton's laws kind of things. But rules could also mean discipline. You're not allowed to do certain things. Do those both come into play, or is it more structure, or more of a?
Yeah. What I meant by rules-based magic was the first. I know exactly how their magic works. This informs its limitations. This informs its abilities. There are also a significant group of restrictions and laws on what mages can and are not allowed to do.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a combination of them, which is good.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Sorry.
That's right. Those are all my questions. So I'm going to move on to Jeff now for a few more.
All right. My first question is, now that you've mixed two very popular genres together, namely sci-fi and fantasy, would you ever consider doing it again with, let's say, two different genres, knowing now what you knew then?
I've considered it. A lot of my ideas that I have sitting in my probably discarded folder kind of fall into that category. Steampunk, dark fantasy, Western high fantasy. I have a few of those sorts of ideas floating around. Unfortunately, looking at the marketability of them and whether or not I think they could sell, I'm forced to the conclusion that they probably wouldn't, mostly because in those cases, both of them will be trying to hit that high fantasy list on Amazon that is a pain to break onto, from what I can tell. And I wouldn't carry as much of my readership over to something that was primarily high fantasy as I would to something that was primarily science fiction.
If you heard, let's say you meet somebody, you're talking to a group of fans or wherever you happen to be, and you found out that someone is a new author, he's contemplating doing the exact same thing you just did, namely take two different genres and mix them together, what sort of advice would you give them? Don't do it, or here's what you'd be on the lookout for, or what?
Look at where the tropes blend. TV tropes is a fantastic resource. Look at it and look at where you have the overlap between those two genres. You can probably, science fiction and fantasy, people know they have very similar tropes a lot of the time, especially in space opera and fantasy, because very often you have the chosen one, you have the brave heroes, you have the band of companions. and you can use those tropes to evoke the feel of both genres at the same time. And I would say what you want to look at when you're collecting those is to look at the commonalities. You'll have to be probably a bit more heavily one or the other. It's very hard to walk the balance where you are exactly half of both. Starship's Mage is very predominantly a space opera in the end. That wasn't my original intent, but that's where it ended up. The other piece of advice I have to give is be very upfront with your readers what they're getting into. Like I've said with Tandoori Pizza, nobody wants to get into this by accident. Nobody wants to feel that they've been baited and switched. You drew them in promising them one thing, and you handed them something else. You can get away with that to a point, especially if you do it well, but nobody wants to walk into a romance and halfway through have it turn into Taken, with Liam Neeson shooting up everybody.
I don't know. That might actually make a romance tolerable. Just my own personal opinion. But okay, inevitably, every author will undergo some form of writer's block during their career. I mean, what have you found to be the most effective means to regain your inspiration and get writing again, if you've ever experienced it? That is.
I like the Stephen King answer. I have a mortgage, but there are, the impending financial doom is not necessarily the best inspiration for the moves. For myself, I find getting outside and moving, especially getting outside. Like, I'll go for walks, and I combine that with soundboarding, because what I do is I go out for a walk with my wife, and she will ask me questions that sound, like they sound irrelevant, but they make me think about what's going on. So by the time I've answered all of my wife's questions about what's currently happening, I usually have a pretty good idea of what needs to happen next.
Okay, does your wife do any sort of proofing for you? Like, for instance, do you write a chapter, hand it to her, and see what she thinks about it?
She does some at the end. So she has read all of my books. She did a full proofread of my last one, but that was the first time she actually had time. She has her own business, and she is actually still in school.
All right. Yeah, I was just kind of curious if by chance, I'll say she's ever hit anything on one of your books and go, what the heck? No. You need to change this. And mine does that to me all the time.
Yes, she did. My wife is an avid climber, and there's a climbing scene in the second Starship's Mage book that she ripped to shreds and made me rewrite.
Yeah,
it was about something. I think we were about 4 days from publication when she made me do that.
Yeah, my wife always tells me I base a lot of the characters on her, and some of them there, and every time she's like, "I am not this nice. I would never say this. You need to tell this." And I'm like, delete. Okay, dear, I got it. Don't worry about it. But and my final question for you is, what have been some of the greatest obstacles you've overcome when mixing those two genres together, the sci-fi and the fantasy?
Given the way it ended up being, the urge to put in more mythological elements as opposed to purely fantastical elements. I decided early on where the magic came from in the setting, but the urge to have, dragons and manticores and elves and dwarves in there with the magic was there for a while, and I really kind of, this doesn't make sense. These two things, what I've set up allows for magic. It doesn't really allow for any of the other mythological or fantastic elements or creations, unless, as the setting goes, someone has gone and genetically engineered one, which I may do basically for my own entertainment at some point.
Yeah, I was always kind of curious about that. So, yeah, because I'm some of my ideas somewhere down the line is like, oh, wouldn't it be cool to make this with that, and just how would you put those two together? And you wouldn't think they would work so well, but something on the drawing boards, anyways.
The biggest obstacle I think we run into is getting covers that get across everything we're trying to do.
Exactly right. Because you don't want any sort of surprises anywhere down the line where if the reader's going, okay, well, this made it look like it was going to be something like this, or the blurb made it sound like that, and I've got something completely different. And those reviews will come back and bite you in the butt. Yeah,
we tried to keep there's always something technological on the cover, and there's almost always a glowing rune on the cover, and there's almost always some form of visible magic on the cover. And that way we're hitting off all the tropes so people know what they're getting into.
Very good idea. Very good.
But spaceships feel better than helicopters.
There you go. All right, let me pass you back over to Lindsay. She's got some marketing questions for you.
Yep, just deleting my question here about covers. I was going to ask you though, is it kind of challenging to like say you want to fit into the category you're in on Amazon, but at the same time Like,
Yeah.
do you ever just say there's got to be a spaceship on here and let the rest fall where it
That
may?
was basically that was the original cover for I think it was the very first Starship's Mage episode was this is what the spaceship looks like. What can we do around it? And then with the second Starship's Mage, Hand of Mars, it was very much we need something technological on the cover, but a spaceship doesn't make any sense because we're looking at the guy on the planet. Hence the helicopter, which, like I said, helicopters don't sell as well as spaceships.
I'll keep that in mind for my foray into science fiction. No helicopters. All right. So in the past, we've kind of talked about how it's ideal if you can really fit neatly into a category on
Mm-hmm.
Amazon and it hit the major tropes. Do you feel that marketing cross-genre fiction, I mean, it must come with some unique challenges. Is there anything special you're doing with like your landing page or anything on Amazon, just kind of picking the best categories you can, or what do you go for?
It's hard to say. I mean, to a certain extent, it still falls into the you have to hit the tropes and you have to give people what they expect. But you're hitting the tropes and the expectations of two genres at once, and that's more complicated and less complicated at the same time because you're narrowing down because you're only really aiming at the overlap. It becomes a lot easier to pick what tropes and what beats you're going to hit. There's only so many things I can say or do in the blurb and the cover that are going to hit both space opera and fantasy. Like, spaceships with runes on them come pretty high on the list. So do people with runes on them fighting spaceships. It works relatively well. To a certain extent, I don't do anything particularly special with the Amazon landing pages or blurbs other than make very clear what the book is. Like, it is something different, it is something relatively unique, and it is something that apparently a lot of people are looking for. And I just make it as easy as I can to find it.
Yeah, it's really cool. Have you actually heard from people in email, like if they're usually space opera fans and not so much fantasy fans, or do you find that a lot of people are like, oh, I love fantasy and I love space adventures? So,
What I find, which fascinates me, is I get people who are saying, I normally read space opera, I never read fantasy, but your stuff was fantastic. And I've had at least one reader who said, I haven't read space opera in years. I'd given up on science fiction. Your stuff showed up in the urban fantasy list, and I read it, and now I'm reading space opera again because I'm discovering that there's a whole bunch of new, awesome space opera available. And and because they read my book, they saw all this other stuff that was available that did appeal to them, but they hadn't even looked at the genre in years. So I'm catching people on both sides who wouldn't read the other genre, but they might actually be interested in it, but they didn't know that until they hit my book, which combined both.
yeah, that's cool. And it's kind of interesting. You would think maybe it's a challenge to be cross-genre, not firmly in one camp, but it is kind of it's kind of interesting that you can put yourself in all the sci-fi space categories, but you can
Mm-hmm.
also, like you're saying, go, why did you pick urban fantasy just out of curiosity over like epic
Uh,
fantasy or?
to me, it is because to me it is urban fantasy. It's a modern or modern future setting with fantasy in it. It's our world with fantasy, which to me is the definition of urban fantasy. Apparently, there might be another one out there. I don't actually know.
Yeah, I always think urban fantasy should be anything that has magic and takes place in a city, right? I mean, it's urban,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know. Apparently not. Apparently I'm wrong.
I have no idea what the definitions are anymore. So I just stick stuff in categories and hope it sticks.
Right. And it looks like right now you're in KDP Select doing Kindle Unlimited. Did you start out that way all along, or have you tried
I
going
did
wide?
not. I was actually wide initially. I was wide through the entire Starship's Mage release. I was wide through both of my fantasy novels, and I experimented with Select with Space Carrier Avalon, which was the first book of the Castle Federation series, mostly to see what would happen. I hadn't done anything in KDP Select. I had, honestly, a bit of a moral aversion to the concept of being exclusive. And then the results on Space Carrier Avalon blew me away. They were so far ahead of everything else I'd achieved, it was mind-boggling. So the second Starship's Mage book went in for 3 months, and then came out, and the second Castle Federation book just went straight in. And I compared the numbers, and I was a financial analyst in a previous life, and numbers is what I did. Financial analysis, comparing these things is what I did. So I sat down and I ran the numbers. and the numbers said that what I was earning by being in Select was literally 100 times what I was earning wide. The difference was mind-boggling. I couldn't justify not being in Select. If I wanted to do this for a living, if I wanted to make money at this, I had to be in Select. There was no other way I could work it in my genres.
And do you feel that you were so much more successful because it was giving you a boost in the rankings and more visibility, or just a combination of that and the page reads, borrows?
Combination of that. Mostly, I think it was just that because suddenly all of my sales were on Amazon, I had that much more visibility on Amazon. And that turned back into page reads and more sales and more visibility. My page reads still are probably less than a third of my income, but that's still vastly more than the 4% of my income that every other vendor combined was. I did an experiment earlier this year where I took the entire Starship Mage series wide and spent a lot of money on advertising, and I made back what I spent on advertising and not a penny more.
Did you do a perma-free, or were you sticking with like 99 cents or full price on that when you went wide?
I was running a bunch of advertising on. I had a free promo for the Starship Mage Omnibus, and I think the Hand of Mars was still full price at the time. But I think I threw $500-600 at promotion, and I got my money back off of Amazon, and I made my money back 5 or 6 times on Amazon. Like even with the books wide, the money was being made on Amazon. The difference was I made less money even with the promos with both books wide off of Amazon than I made from KU with one book in KU in the month before.
Yeah, it's definitely it's hard. You kind of want to be out there everywhere and be available everywhere. Did you have any fans on the other sides that have objected to you going into exclusive?
I've had a couple of quiet complaints. I've mostly directed them towards the fact that I do have an advanced readers team, and anyone who reaches out to me personally and says I can't buy, I don't buy Amazon books, I say if you sign up for my advanced readers team and don't feel too icky leaving a review on Amazon, I'll give you free copies of the books 2 weeks before they come out.
I don't support Amazon, but I will leave reviews there for free books.
That's all I'm asking for sometimes.
Cool. Yeah, I've been thinking about it myself, as I've always been wide with all my stuff, because KDP Select wasn't even a thing when I got started. But I think with my new Sci-Fi series, this is going to be the time to try going into Kindle Unlimited, just because nobody's dog wants to go out. Nobody's waiting for the book, or hopefully nobody will get too mad about it. But I thought I'd do the same thing and just be like, well, I sign up for my mailing list here and I'll give you review copies.
Yeah, my suggestion is there's certain genres that definitely seem to do better in KU than others. Science fiction definitely does very, very well in Kindle Unlimited. And because my stuff is predominantly science fiction, I do very, very well in Kindle Unlimited.
Yeah, I've noticed that, and it's kind of interesting. I've gone through the Space Opera Top 100, and it does seem like most of the books there are in KU. And it's interesting because you hear about the romance people being big into KU because they can read just so many books. A lot of them will just read books and books a week, so that's great for them. And I wouldn't have necessarily guessed that space opera and sci-fi is the same way. I think with epic fantasy, maybe just because the books are so long, a lot of times people aren't devouring them so quickly. I don't know.
I know before I bought a Kindle Unlimited membership, I was literally spending $100 a month on space opera books just to keep up with my own reading habits and my own genre. I couldn't afford that.
Yeah, well, I always think it should be tax deductible if you're an author. I don't know. I haven't tried that yet with the IRS, but it seems like if you're buying fiction that you actually write in that genre, it's research, right?
My understanding of Canadian tax law is no. And I'm a designated accountant, so my understanding of Canadian tax law is pretty good.
All right, well, maybe I won't try that until I have like a really crackerjack accountant.
You might be able to get away with it, the IRS. I wouldn't try it myself.
Yeah, I hear they're pretty, not too understanding in that area. But so speaking of advertising, which sites have you tried that you've had some good luck with? I guess I'm curious, as doing cross genre, do you have any trouble with the sites like BookBub that they've got sci-fi and they've got
Book
fantasy,
Club
and
won't
it's a
take me.
separate. They just won't take you.
Book Club will not touch my stuff. I got one UK promotion for one of the space opera books. That was it. Otherwise, every time I send them over, I get you don't fit our needs at this time. And, that's fine. If they don't feel they can slot me into a proper category or are not of interest to their readers, fair enough. Given some of what I have seen them put out, I find that hard to believe personally, but that is their decision to make. I have opinions, but I'm not going to state them in public. I have also used and been very impressed with Book Barbarian, BookSend's Free Book C, and eReader News Today. Those are the ones that come to mind as having been successful. I don't have my spreadsheets open and to hand. I actually have detailed spreadsheet analysis of the ROI of each vendor I used for promotion.
I would expect that from an accountant. So I'm a little disappointed you don't have them and can't give us exact percentages, though.
I am on my laptop, so I don't even have two screens to look at with. My workstation doesn't actually have a webcam, so.
All right. Yeah, I've kind of found with BookBub, with the pen name I do, science fiction romance, they're not so. So I've gotten a few, but these are books with hundreds of reviews, and they're kind of like, because I feel like with BookBub, it's really got to fit exactly what their category is. So if you're cross-genre, it can be kind of tough with them.
Yeah.
So the other sites, though, they seem like they have no problem taking your stuff.
They don't. They've taken everything I've sent them. I mean, ENT is like BookBub often is full, but they've happily taken my money, if nothing else. Generally, they've succeeded quite well for me, which I suspect does reasonably well for them as well.
All right, last questions from me. Have you played around with pricing at all? It looked like you kind of had a mix of $3.99 and $4.99 right now.
Yeah. So at one point, all of the novellas were 99 cents originally, and then for a while, all of the novels were $2.99. And I realized that I wanted to experiment with that, and I kind of slowly crept the price up over time. And I eventually settled on the current set of price, which is first books in the series are $3.99, and second books in the series and further books are $4.99. So there's a bit of an introductory discount if you're buying in at the beginning. And then the better of my two fantasy standalones is $4.99, and the not so well regarded of my two fantasy standalones is $3.99. That's a result of a bunch of experimentation. I can't even remember enough of the details to really tell you. But that seems to have worked out really well. I mean, I ran the numbers, and I sold less units with a $4.99 launch, I made more money with a $4.99 launch.
Making more money is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Have you, with the standalones you mentioned, have you had any challenges? I know a lot of people, we all kind of say you got to write in series, then you can promo the first one. Any challenges that you've overcome, or challenges that you haven't overcome with the standalone
Challenges
fiction?
that I haven't overcome? All of them. Neither of those books sells particularly well, sadly. I thought I write science fiction / fantasy hybrids. People will happily pick up my fantasy as well. No. Voice of Mars, the latest Starship Mage book, I launched at the start of this month. It has at this point made twice as much money as those two standalones combined. That gives you an idea of how well those two books have done.
So we're still looking for someone to interview who's just rocking it with the standalone stories.
On the flip side of that, Space Carrier Avalon, when it was originally launched, was launched as a standalone. And it was, at the time, my best-selling book to date by an order of magnitude. It sold something like 15,000 copies in its first 3 months. It was ridiculous. It's no longer my best-selling novel because Voice of Mars managed, at least in terms of best-selling at the beginning, Voice of Mars had a better launch, but it was a very good launch, a very strong book, and it was a standalone. I looked at its success and went, well, I'd be an idiot not to write a sequel to this. Everyone really apparently loved it. So I wrote a sequel to it, and off we went. And now
Maybe yeah, that could be true of a lot of authors, because that was me with my Dragon Blood series too. The first one sold well enough. I never intended to write a series. I was like, well, characters are kind of fun, world's kind of fun. I think I'll go back to it. So maybe
That one was
every
very
author
good.
out
I
there,
enjoyed that one.
maybe every author that has a standalone that actually does well decides to do a series, so then they can no longer
I
be
think
considered standalones.
there's some standalones that just are standalone by their very nature, and you can't really do a sequel to them. And there are some standalones that are open to a sequel. At this point, I plan to slot a standalone or two into each year as I go forward, but they're all going to be designed so that if they blow up, I can write a sequel to them. Because if nothing else, both of my two major series are slotted to be about 6 books. And once they're over, they're kind of over, and then I need something else to keep bringing in money. I kind of like this lifestyle, so I like telling stories for a living. I'd like to keep doing so, but my current stories only last 6 books, so I'll need some more stories to tell.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan, actually, and I can see that, just either doing a standalone or a trilogy, and then having it open to doing more books if
Exactly.
it does well. But if it doesn't, you can end it up, because I've actually started things where I'm like, oh, this is going to be an 8-book series, and I lose interest, and they don't sell that well, and I'm like, oh, crud, I got to figure
Yeah.
out a way to end this.
One of my fantasy standalones was intended to be the first book of a 5-book cycle. That one, and it stands relatively well on its own, so I don't feel particularly guilty leaving it out. But I do get emails and blog comments and reviews going, where's the sequel? And my response is, well, get 10,000 of your closest friends to buy it and we'll talk. Because if it's not going to make me any money, I can't write the sequel.
Yeah, totally understand. All right, let me hand you to the guys, and they've got some questions too.
Yep. I also, by the way, have the poorly selling standalone that could have been a series, and yeah, 2 people have come to me saying this is the superhero book. Regular listeners know that I wrote a superhero book that is it's my cautionary tale.
Yeah.
I have 2 people who have contacted me repeatedly asking for the sequel, and I'm like, 2 ain't enough. I'm sorry.
I wish it was more than 2.
Pay for themselves.
Yeah, I wish it was only 2 people contacting me for sequels to City in the Sky. No problem. It's just that everyone who read it seemed to love it, but none of the people have read it.
That's the curse of a book. Like, you don't want to have a good book that no one read, because you get excited fans who cannot be satisfied because there aren't enough of them.
Exactly.
All right, so interestingly enough, the first question I have is, how much interaction do you have with your readers? Have you gotten an idea of what sorts of readers you tend to attract most?
I have a limited interaction with my readers, but that's not that's as much because I don't seek it out. I have a blog. People comment there. I respond to questions there. I respond to questions on Goodreads, and as very clearly a lot of people have worked out, I respond to posts, questions, and comments on the Amazon discussion forums, as people promptly post questions that are clearly directed at me on the Amazon discussion forums. I do generally try to answer emails that I get sent, unless they're very strange. I'll get some strange ones, I think. But by and large, if people send me emails, I do try and answer them. I interact with people as they reach out to me, but I don't really make a point of reaching out to my readers, except by putting out new books.
It's a sound policy. Although I have to say, getting the strange emails is sort of a badge of honor, I think. Like, you want to have, like they say, you want to have 1,000 true fans. I also feel like you should have at least 2 strange fans.
The strangest one I got was the one who sent me a quite long email complaining that from the description of the book, the fact that the carrier was being decommissioned made no sense to them, and they couldn't get past that enough to even read the sample of the book, wherein why the carrier is being decommissioned was explained in the first 2 pages.
Hokey smokes.
But they had the time to find my email and email me.
Yeah, it's great stuff. All right, you mentioned Star Wars. Star Wars has probably asserted itself at this point as the premier science fantasy franchise. The fact that it's reasserted itself in the public eye, do you feel like that's driven more interest to your books?
I think so. I definitely think so. It's hard to say for sure, because by the time it really started reasserting itself, Starship's made, the first serial was complete, the second book was starting to come out. The third book came out, well, the third book just came out, so it didn't come. None of them have come out particularly close to the movie releases. We've joked about and actually gone and costed out running a book trailer in front of Star Wars. We actually costed out what it would cost us to run a trailer in front of every showing of a movie in every one branch of theaters in Canada, a 30-second book trailer. It came out to about 150. It was somewhere between $60,000 and $250,000 Canadian because they weren't very clear on the costing for December. The regular cost would be about $65,000, but they also said there was a premium for December, probably because Star Wars was coming out.
It's also Oscar season, so people tend to put out their best movies in December.
Yeah, so I imagine that doing it in the United States would cost at least 10 times as much, and to put together a decent book trailer would cost, another couple $100,000 on its own. So it's not exactly something we have the budget for,
No.
but it's a really tempting thought.
It's amazing how very expensive the traditional advertising things are. My father he's like, we should put your ads in the subways. He works on the subway. I'm like, yeah, and he got me the card of the guy who does the advertising, and I'm like, we ran the numbers, and they are an order of magnitude higher than I usually use to promote a book.
Yep.
So yeah,
I've done traditional advertising campaigns.
How much money the big publishers have.
Yep. I've done traditional advertising campaigns in my previous life, and I can't justify. The return would probably be there, especially if I could put a book trailer in front of Star Wars. The return would be there no matter what that cost me. But I don't think, GoFundMe or Kickstarter aside, I don't think I could actually come up with the $2 million it would take me to do that. No. And I have better things to do with $2 million.
Yeah. Yeah, there comes a point where once you have the money to do that sort of thing, we'll just keep the money.
I'll go buy a house.
Exactly. All right, and sometimes, like with cross-genre in particular, as you said, like the tandoori chicken example, pizza example, by the way, which I've had because I live. Colonia, New Jersey has some good Indian food. But
my wife loves tandoori chicken pizza.
It's good. Yeah.
I haven't actually tried it myself.
Yeah. Good heavens. Well, give it a shot. I recommend it.
Okay.
Sometimes it helps to give someone an example of your franchise, and you can use a pre-existing one. Now, for Star Wars is a good example. Have you ever invoked Star Wars in order to explain to someone the sort of thing that you write?
Yep. Totally. I generally do make the compare. If I'm making that level of comparison, I'm usually making it to someone who's not particularly familiar with space opera at all. So I'll usually use the combined example of Star Wars and Star Trek to make the example of that's what space opera looks like. My stuff's more like Star Wars. It's got the strange, magical guys wandering around and the roving troubleshooters of the interstellar government, etc., etc.
Yeah. It's really like space opera being a thing. It's funny that a lot of people just don't know the term space opera. I've had to explain what a space opera is. Like, technically, some of my stuff falls into space opera. I'll list it under space opera, but I've had to explain that more often than steampunk, which is interesting to me.
I had at least one person who admitted to me later that she went away and Googled it because she was envisaging something along the lines of, opera in space. Opera. Oh!
Yes. I've had people say, so it's like that scene in The Fifth Element with the lady on stage? Like, no. Well, I mean, that could happen, I suppose, within a space opera. Mm-hmm. But no, not specifically that. All right. Well, that concludes all the questions I had from marketing. So now Jeff will ask you a few more.
I can just imagine someone going, Fifth Element, that weird blue lady singer. I'm like, oh my God, no. I've had to explain space opera a few times too, so it's.
Yeah, I think we all have.
Yeah, but okay. So, of all the promotions and advertising you've done for your books, have there been any standouts for you? I mean, have you found anything that's been seriously underrated or overrated?
Overrated? Any type of general banner advertising. We spent quite a bit of money on that during the years that Starship. During the year we were rolling out the novellas. We ran a bunch of ads through. I don't even remember the actual service now. but they were one of the big banner providers across a lot of the more geeky websites. And you could bid on ads, and they had Schlock Mercenary on there as someplace you could bid on. I gave Howard Taylor a lot of money, and I think that was the only one of them that actually returned to me at all. And I'm perfectly comfortable having given Howard Taylor a lot of money for the advertising I got on the site. But
so I would imagine you probably tried like Facebook and probably Goodreads too, because I know they all offer those little advertising.
I haven't actually tried Facebook yet. Facebook's on our to-do list once my wife is done school. She is actually a marketing person. So once she's done school, she's going to dig into the Facebook ads and probably set up a Facebook page for us. We don't have one of those yet either. Goodreads I poured a lot of money into. Amazon ads I poured a lot of money into. And I'm forced to the conclusion the problem might not so much be the advertising programs as my advertising, because it has just flopped on so many platforms. Best advertising I've ever found is to just put out another book.
Yeah, very, very true. Best way to keep people interested is just keep releasing new material.
Yep.
But, okay, so speaking of Facebook, social media, are you for or against? Do you have much of a social presence anywhere?
I am for it with restrictions. I don't have a Facebook page, but my personal profile on Facebook can be followed. But I will not be friended on Facebook, if that makes sense. If I friend you on Facebook, I've actually had a conversation with you. It might have been online, it might have been whatever, but we have actually communicated. I'm not going to add someone on Facebook I've never communicated with. But you can follow me on Facebook. I have no problem with that. You're going to get the exact same material on Facebook as you'll get on my Twitter account because the two crossfeed. Anything that's less public than that isn't posted publicly. I do a lot of friends-only posting for obvious reasons. But I also have a Twitter account. I think I even have a Google Plus account somewhere. I'm not even sure I'd be able to log into it at this point, but it exists.
All right.
My Twitter account probably sees the most active public use.
Now, okay, for your Twitter account, do you actually tweet? I guess that's the right terminology, because yes, I don't have a Twitter account. Do you actually tweet about like your own book releases, book reviews, or just weird random thoughts?
All of the above.
Oh.
I'll tweet when I release. I tweet. I follow a number of other authors. C. Murphy is currently making the transition from traditionally published to hybrid. And for whatever reason, she and I started passing indie publishing tips back and forth. She's very new to it and isn't quite sure what the best practices are, and I follow her and I see her questions, and I do know what most of the best practices are, so I tweeted her and so this is what you might want to try, and this is what you might want to try. And she's been really enthusiastically uptaking that, which is kind of adorable. It's interesting to watch someone who has been as successful in traditional publishing as C. Murphy has step out into the indie scene. It's sad to say, but I think the fact that she was so successful in Trad gives her a bit more oomph when she says that this is a legitimate path. Because she's not one who couldn't get into real publishing. She's one who did and is choosing to go this way for her own benefit at this point.
Alrighty. And finally, I see from your website that you utilize a newsletter. How do you encourage new readers to sign up? Do you offer incentives? Links? Do you provide links in your front and back matter of your books? What do you typically do?
There are links in the front and back matter of my books that say click here to sign up for the newsletter or sign up for the newsletter on the website. I'm not as obvious about it as I might be, but I do give away trade paperbacks to one newsletter member of each time. Here's the one that's actually going to get mailed out in the next few days. That's why it's sitting on my desk. It needs to get stuck in a mailer and sent out. I need to actually select a winner for that too now that I think about it, but things I will get to. Somebody wins every time I release a new book, one member of the mailing list gets a free trade paperback. Usually signed, so they come to me and then I mail them out. I don't just drop ship them from CreateSpace, so that would be much cheaper.
Do you have any restrictions on where not to send it? Because I know shipping can get expensive, especially like, oh yeah, sure, I'll go ahead and offer a giveaway on my website. I'm sorry, you live where in Poland? Holy crap! And you're looking at the shipping rates there, like, okay, we're gonna cross that country off the list to make sure no more winners there. But
I have not yet encountered a shipping cost I was unprepared to pay. But most at this point of the 6 I've sent out, I believe 5 were in the United States and 1 was in Canada.
Oh, that's not bad.
I have to do cross-Atlantic shipping. And small package shipping out of Canada isn't bad. I mean, I'm spending more for the shipping than I am for the book by an order of magnitude. But the purpose is not really to be cost effective. The purpose is to hopefully convert somebody from the type of fan who is reading my stuff on Kindle Unlimited to the type of fan who has a Glynn Stewart bookshelf in their house.
Very
The fact
true.
that there are people with the Glynn Stewart bookshelf in their house hurts my brain, but that's an entirely different issue.
Yeah, it's just knowing that I've got people in various countries all across Europe and whatnot that they've got one of my books sitting on their shelf, and then they are telling me, "Oh yeah, I've got my own. You got your own shelf there. I just picked up another copy. Wish you lived close by so you could go ahead and sign them for me." I'm like, dude, you're in Wales. I would love to. I really, really would, but it's going to be a while before I'm that far north there. But
Yeah. Oh, I'll be in Wales in August, so if anyone wants me to sign books in Wales, email me.
there you go. There you go.
Family
All right,
wedding
let
in
me
Kent. So.
All right, well, let me hand you back to Lindsay. I believe we can start wrapping this up for you.
Okay.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of good information, and I'm glad to know I'm not the only one that couldn't make Amazon advertising work.
I haven't
I did get
yet heard of anyone who did.
Well, there's actually someone who commented on my blog, and I did a post with his comment because he actually did get it to work really well, and I think he has nonfiction, but there are
Yeah,
people
see, I think
apparently
we'll do
making.
that.
Yeah, there's some book. He said one thing is not to target like specific authors, just to go really broad and
I
target
think
like
my
all
big
of science
mistake is trying to
fiction.
target my own people.
Yeah, that's what I
The
did too. I
out-of-10
was like,
science fiction got discontinued for lack of, I can't remember how they phrased it, but wasn't useful to reader, wasn't useful to viewers, so we're discontinuing your ad.
I didn't get discontinued. I just didn't get enough like impressions and clicks to even. I don't even think I got charged. It's like I'm at like one click.
Oh, I got charged an arm and a leg for not much.
Oh, okay. Well, someday we're gonna find somebody that's actually knows the secret and has got advice for us. But
I'll make sure to watch
yeah.
that webcast.
Okay. Just last thing. Do you have any advice for new authors who are coming out with their first book soon? Maybe especially if they're doing cross-genre fiction.
It's the best advice I've given anybody so far, I think, is just don't give up. The first book may take off, it may not. The first episode of Starship Mage sold 53 copies in 4 months. It was a 99-cent novel. That didn't even pay for a cheap dinner. I couldn't even go out to McDonald's on what I made in my first 3 months as an independently published author. The second book did better. The third novella did better. The fourth novella did better. The omnibus of all 5 of them paid for my down payment on my house. Don't give up. I mean, look at what you're doing. Try and see if there's something you're doing wrong, because God knows there's always something that we're doing wrong. But improve, but don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. People will tell you, you have to write to market. You have to follow all the tropes. You can't do something special snowflake until you've paid your dues. Well, maybe you can, because 90% of our readers don't care. They care if you've got a shiny cover, and they care if your book looks interesting, and they care if the sample reads well. If those 3 things are true, you don't need to have paid your dues, because your readers aren't looking to see if you've written 10,000 perfectly marketed books before. They're looking to see if your book looks interesting.
All right, good advice. And I think it's funny that Chris Fox introduced you to us, and you're kind of poking fun at what he said last week.
We've different opinions, and Chris isn't wrong either. I mean, it is a lot easier to sell something that is written exactly to market. And you can do that, and you can do it very, very well. One of my series is arguably written to market. That wasn't how I would have phrased it when I did it, but I could definitely say that it was written to market. But no one can argue that Starship Mage was written to market. Starship Mage was written because it amused me. Fortunately, it amuses and entertains a lot of other people.
Yeah,
Can't
that's
ask
the
for anything
cool
better
thing.
than that.
That's the cool thing about doing it as an indie too, is that you can actually make good money without selling 1,000,000 copies. You can find your niche of people that want that and put the down payment on your house with the earnings.
Don't want to put the down payment on my house at this point. Let's put it that way.
All right. Well, thanks for talking tonight. And where can people find you? And which book should they check out of yours?
I am mostly available on Amazon or at www.phalanxpen.com. Nobody can spell that, so if you could drop that in the show notes, that would probably be best. If they're checking out my stuff, the best things to check out are the Starship Mage Omnibus which is the first book in the Starship's Mage series, or Space Carrier Avalon, which is the first book in the Castle Federation series.
Awesome. And we will put links to all of that and your website in show 73. So just come on by the site, guys, and we'll have that up shortly.
All right. Well, it was nice meeting you, and thanks for all the info, man.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Thanks for listening, everyone.
So long.